Legendary Pokemon are some of the most prominent Pokemon ever, but sometimes there are legendaries that are missing from the Pokemon games that you never get to see. And in this video, I'm gonna tell you who these missing legendaries are and show you what they could look like. A good example of this kind of thing that we're gonna start off with, ironically, concerns a mythical Pokemon. Yes, mythicals and legendaries are separate groups, but they're also more or less the same thing. So for our purposes in this video, we're gonna just lump them all together and include a mythical in this conversation. With that said, we see what I am gonna call a pixie mythical in essentially every generation. These are small, cutesy mythical Pokemon who oftentimes also float around, and their cuteness often belies their true power. These are Pokemon like Mew, Jirachi, Manaphy, Pecharunt. We see one in basically every generation. But we never got to see one in Generation 8. The Sword and Shield generation was pretty atypical when it came to its legendaries, and it never introduced that cute little mythical that basically every other generation has. So what might a mythical like this look like for the Galar region? Well, maybe something like Magimist. Magimist is a psychic fairy type, and it's honestly a shame that this kind of Pokemon was missing from Gen 8, because the perfect concept for one was sitting there just waiting to be taken advantage of. The main legendaries of the Galar region, like Zacian, Zamazenta, and Eternatus, take a lot of inspiration from King Arthur and other similar folklore. You have two heroes with a sword and a shield fighting against an evil dragon. It's pretty front and center when you actually think about it, which is why there was a golden opportunity to introduce a mythical like Magimist who is based on Merlin. Merlin is a very well-known wizard from the Legend of King Arthur and is basically the prototypical image of what a wizard is. As a result, he is very well known, and due to the fact that he is already a legendary character, both literally and figuratively, he would have been the perfect basis for a mythical Pokemon. In my opinion, it would have been so insanely perfect that it's honestly hard to even describe, but instead of that, we ended up getting Zarude, who is one of the most out-of-pocket mythical Pokemon ever, and I feel like is also widely seen as one of the worst. Personally, I feel like something like Magimist would have been way better from just about every single angle imaginable, but also, at the same time, it wouldn't even have had to replace Zarude, as both of these Pokemon could have coexisted no problem. So it really and truly is a shame that this kind of Pokemon is just missing from the Galar Pokedex, and that Merlin as a whole wasn't really used at all as the concept for a Pokemon in this generation, because honestly, it would have been a perfect match and would have made for a great Pokemon and a great mythical Pokemon, in my opinion. And yet another perfect match is you and all the stuff in my merch store. Obviously, we are all about plushies and trading cards as Pokemon fans, and on my merch store you can grab some plushies and trading cards of my Fakemon that appear in my videos as a way to support the channel. There's Narwade plushies, Fulkachi plushies, and booster packs from my upcoming Histrobi Chronicles trading card game. The plushies are also super soft and squishy, the cards are super well made and a ton of fun to open, and all the merch is extremely high quality. So be sure to hit the link in the description to check it out and pick something up, because every bit of support goes straight into making videos for you guys, and it genuinely makes a huge difference in helping my content to be possible. So hit that link and grab a plushie or some cards, and thanks a ton for all your support. Now that we have introduced the kind of Pokemon we're talking about here though, let's go ahead and move on to one that has personally intrigued me for quite a while. In Generation 6, Pokemon X and Y did something quite surprising, as this generation was the very first to not introduce a sub-legendary trio, such as the legendary birds of Kanto, the legendary beasts of Johto, and so on. Even post-Generation 6, most of the following generations also had these kinds of Pokemon too, so Gen 6 is definitely an outlier in this regard, and therefore it makes the idea of what these missing legendary Kalos Pokemon could have been like very intriguing. It's so intriguing, in fact, that I've actually explored this idea before, but I wanted to revisit the concept and refresh my own personal take on it for this video. So I would like to introduce you to Arbonor, Pyronor, and Hydronor. This trio is another that, similar to Magimist, I feel like is a great fit for what this legendary trio could have actually been. While it is anyone's guess at the end of the day in terms of what Game Freak would actually do, we do know that the legendaries of Kalos follow a heavy Norse theme. So it only stands to reason that this legendary trio would follow suit had they actually been included in the games. Therefore, this trio are based on the Norns, and I believe this is another perfect fit type of situation. The Norns are part of Norse mythology as well, and are a trio of deities that determine the fates and destinies of humans. They also tend to the sacred tree known as Yggdrasil, and therefore have a connection to it just like the other Kalos legendaries. So personally, I feel like the Norns would be an excellent fit for this missing legendary trio. Due to their role of determining the fates of humans, each of these Pokemon has the Psychic type. But because I didn't want them to be too similar to each other by just being Psychic type, and I also didn't want them to be too similar to the Lake Guardians, who also do just that, I decided to also give each of these Pokemon a different secondary type to help them stand out from one another. Arbonor is a Psychic Grass type, which is also reflected in its name, which comes from Arbor and Norn. Pyronor is a Psychic Fire type, with this also being reflected in its name, as its name comes from Pyro. And Hydronor is a Psychic Water type, whose name comes from Hydro in order to reflect this. Design-wise, I actually had a little bit of help, as I actually used Floette's beta design, which was recently leaked, as a sort of base for these Pokemon. And I did this just because I really like that design, and it was the exact kind of thing that I wanted the design of these Pokemon to look like. So the idea was to use this as a sort of reference to create a similar design, but with more legendary aura that could actually feel like a legendary Pokemon, while also peppering in just a tiny bit from the previous designs of these Pokemon that I created as well. And I think overall, they turned out pretty great, and are exactly what I would love to see this legendary trio look like if we ever got the chance to see them. By the way, a big shout out as always goes to Rgreywind for drawing the artwork of these designs, and as always, you can check him out with the links in the description. These next entries are going to turn back the clock a little bit, because we are going to go back all the way to Generation 1. Gen 1 is very unique when it comes to legendaries, as it is currently the only generation of Pokemon games to not have a pair, or even a trio, of Box Art Legendaries. With Box Art Legendaries being central to basically every game afterwards, this is frankly a huge missing piece of Kanto's Pokedex that every other region has. So what might Kanto Box Art Legendaries look like if we ever returned to Kanto someday and saw something like that? Well, maybe something like Conqueror and Divinikai. With these two, we tried to give them more of a Gen 1 vibe to fit in with the more simplistic style of Kanto Pokemon. And the other thing that they also do is follow the very heavy kaiju theme that Kanto has in its Pokedex. It's been mentioned in interviews that kaiju-like designs are what many of the very first Pokemon were designed like before they eventually started introducing cuter Pokemon as well, and that is why you see many kaiju-like Pokemon in Gen 1, such as Rhydon, Nidoking, and Nidoqueen. Therefore, it only felt right to have a kaiju theme for these Kanto Box Art Legendaries, especially considering that kaiju are also insanely powerful, legendary-level monsters themselves. And the two that I chose in particular to base these Pokemon on are Godzilla and King Kong. Not only are these two extremely iconic, but they also have a well-known rivalry with one another, so I thought that would make a lot of sense for them as version counterpart Pokemon. I also figured that they should be themed around the colors of red and green to go along with those versions as well, although a blue or yellow Pokemon could potentially be possible too, again depending on what Game Freak decided to do if they ever did something like this. Type-wise, Conqueror is a fire rock type, and Divinikai is a fire grass type, and this has to do with their mythological origins. As legendaries, it only felt right that these Pokemon should have at least some kind of mythos behind them, even if they are meant to be a simpler Gen 1 kind of mon, so they are also inspired by Ninigi and Konohana Sakuya Hime, which are a pair of deities in Japanese mythology. I'm no expert, so I'm just going to give you an extremely simplified version of this story, but basically, Konohana Sakuya Hime is the goddess of Mount Fuji and volcanoes in Japanese mythology, and this is where the fire type comes from that both of these Pokemon share. The story goes that Ninigi and Sakuya Hime fell in love, so Ninigi asked Sakuya Hime's father for her hand in marriage. Her father proposed his older daughter to Ninigi instead, but he refused, and although Ninigi and Sakuya Hime were still able to be married, this laid a sort of curse on mankind, as the older daughter, Iwanaga Hime, represented immortality, and would have granted long-lasting life like rocks had Ninigi married her. However, since Ninigi chose Sakuya Hime, that meant that life would now be short and fleeting, like the cherry blossoms that Sakuya Hime represents. So, my bad telling of that story aside, that is where the fire rock and fire grass typings come from, as it represents a sort of immortality versus mortality kind of theme. Meanwhile, in terms of their names, Conqueror works quite well in my opinion, as it comes from Kong, Conqueror, and the name Rory, which means Red King, which ties to both the red theming of this Pokemon and the King Kong inspiration, so I actually like this one quite a lot. For Divinikai, it comes from divine and divinity because it's a legendary and is based on Godzilla, and it also comes from kaiju. But to be honest, I do feel like there is a better name out there for this Pokemon, so if you guys have any suggestions, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear what ideas you guys might have, and also let me know all your thoughts on all of these other legendaries as well. Be sure to leave a like to help out the video too if you enjoyed it, and I will see you all very soon with another video too. Until then, as always, thanks so much for watching this one, I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.